Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. It's always an honor to share with you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. So I really appreciate you joining us today, this week. And there's a lot of news to share with you. And I really don't know where to start in terms of how to focus our analysis. Of course, everything is kind of is revolves around decisions being made from the White House, Donald Trump, and how these decisions of the White House team is impacting Mexico in different ways, not only on Mexico's economy, but also Mexico's financial system and Mexican politics. That's why I really appreciate today's guest. He's been joining us throughout the years. It's been a while since we've spoken to him, Kenneth Smith. He was the chief negotiator for the USMCA, also known in Spanish as TEMEC, and he's a partner at a consulting firm called Argon. Uh, Kenneth, welcome to the show. I mean, with everything that's happened this week, I don't know what to say. Let's start with what made headlines in the last 2 or 3 days. And it's all started out with announcements coming out from the White House, basically finger pointing three Mexican financial institutions um, and accusing them, or at least, basically accusing them of potentially money laundering activities, not only with Chinese companies that may or may not be bringing in precursor chemicals into Mexico, but also accusing them of doing money laundering for the cartels, which, according to the United States, and ever since Donald Trump was sworn in, these groups should be now considered terrorist organizations. So let's start with that very serious accusations from the White House. And how the Mexican government is reacting to these accusations. Welcome to the show, Kenneth.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria. It's a real pleasure to be with you once again. And of course, as you were saying, there's a lot of things happening. This is more than a three-ring circus going on in
Hmm.
terms of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, and
Hmm.
the serious accusations, as you mentioned, by the Department of Treasury of the U.S. come at a time when the Mexican government is trying to negotiate its way out of the different blocks of tariffs that are affecting Mexico. One of which is, of course, related to cooperation by Mexico on issues related to immigration and security, specifically reducing the flow of fentanyl towards the US. And what we have seen over the last months, I mean, ever since the Sheinbaum administration came to power, is a big effort to change the security policy in Mexico without saying that it's changing, right? She won't come out and say
Right.
that the policy of hugs instead of bullets that Lopez Obrador implemented, which essentially left a big void in terms of the actions by the government against organized crime. She's changing that without saying that she is. And so
Hmm.
over the last few months, there's been a sense of progress in Mexico in terms of the security strategy, in terms of
Hmm.
major seizures of drugs, arrests, extraditions of dangerous criminals, etc. And even the president of the United States, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, have said that Mexico is doing a great job on that front.
Hmm.
However, this is not translated into an elimination of the tariffs, right? So
Right.
it seems that Mexico is getting a pat on the back, but at the same time, we're not resolving the tariff situation. And this new blow, let's call it that, by the Department of Treasury, what we're hearing is that the Mexican government was not warned that this was coming, right? So,
Well, you
it's
know,
difficult to see how that's going to play out, first of all, and how
mhm.
this affects the negotiations on the tariffs.
I think they were warned because, and even the president talked about it. They had received, there had been communications between Treasury and I believe Hacienda, kind of warning that the United States was concerned about certain transactions from these three institutions. And basically, I think this was a couple of weeks ago. Basically, Mexican authorities, including their financial intelligence unit, which is kind of the U.S. version of FinCEN, came out and said, no, there's just not information. And they didn't do very much. So it was interesting that they kind of warned them that they thought something was wrong. And they didn't have to, which is interesting because this legislation, as you know, is basically a type of legislation and it's kind of what the way the United States threatens the financial systems of other countries by taking steps that includes freezing their assets, people's assets in the United States, taking their visas away, not permitting them to do financial transactions with U.S. entities, including banks, or threatening even banks if you have bank accounts from people that we consider to either be drug cartel leaders or terrorists, we can also sanction the banks or these financial institutions. So what was interesting is that I think the United States did warn them that they were concerned. The Mexican government didn't do anything, and then bam, with these kind of it was in on these different social media, it was announced that the United States was concerned about these three institutions, and the president came out and you heard her comments that according to them there was no evidence, and then to be concerned, and if the U.S. showed evidence, which I don't think they are going to show evidence because they don't have to, that a couple hours later, then you had the banking commission coming in and basically taking over the three institutions. So it was a very messy deal. But what I think it's interesting is I am getting a sense, and this is one of the things I wanted to ask you, is I don't know who is in charge of these types of strategies. You know what I mean? I don't think the president knew or understood how serious this is, and that the United States can unilaterally do this, and it's done it before with other people and with other criminal organizations and even banks. So do you have a sense that somebody's in charge of the strategy of with the United States, even in the tariffs? I mean, I'm just not too sure in the negotiations who's in charge, like the overall policy. I'm very confused about that.
Well, it's complex precisely because President Trump, from the beginning of his administration, has sort of set out the goal to withhold trade preferences, so pretty much freezing for all intents and purposes the type of preferential trade that we had under the
Hmm.
USMCA, making it subject to specific conditions related to issues that don't have anything to do with trade, such as immigration
Right.
and fentanyl.
Right.
At first there was a threat that all products were going to have prohibitive tariffs going into the United States.
Hmm.
Then, the pressure from the private sector, importers, exporters, investors, led to this partial reprieve, right? So we have the advantage that other countries don't have when they're facing these tariffs, that USMCA complying products do not have to pay the tariffs. But still,
Hmm.
we're still getting hit with a substantial amount of tariffs, and they are linked to this cooperation on immigration and security. And we know for a fact that there's been several different agencies in Mexico participating in these conversations when it comes to immigration and security. On immigration, definitely the foreign ministry has taken a leading role in that. On security,
Wait.
there's been meetings in the United States where the security
Hmm.
cabinet, almost everybody who's involved in the security cabinet, has come down or up to Washington, D.C. to have these meetings. And that
Hmm.
the problem is that we haven't received, and the general population in Mexico hasn't received precise information as to how those conversations are going. Is there a work plan? Is there a timetable where we think they could come to an agreement and have what the
Hmm.
media has been mentioning over the last 2 weeks, a global or economic security agreement? We just
Hmm.
don't know. And we know that on the
Yeah.
tariff side, when you talk about, the tariffs are Mexico's facing on automotive goods, steel, aluminum, it's the Ministry
Hmm.
of Economy. The Minister Ebrard, the Secretary of Economy of Mexico, is traveling constantly to Washington along with his
Hmm.
undersecretary. So that's the cast of characters that's going to DC. The question is this going to yield results? Or is the announcement by the Department of Treasury and these accusations going to complicate those negotiations? And let's not forget that right now, as all of this is happening, the US is also conducting 7 additional investigations on national security on key industrial sectors: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, jet engines, heavy trucks. All of this
Right.
hits at the heart of Mexico and Canada as well, if indeed in a couple of months those investigations turn into tariffs against the number one and number two trading partners of the US. So it is a
Can
complex situation that we're
Can you give
facing.
me, I had forgotten about those investigations. Can you give us an update, or what are the purpose of these investigation, and how does this impact the Mexico, the negotiation in regards to tariffs? And of course, the negotiation of the USMCA that is supposed to, it may happen before, but it's supposed to definitely take place next year.
Well, the first time that President Trump, in his first mandate, utilized the Section 232 of the trade law, which
Hmm.
allows for trade barriers to be imposed in cases that where national security is jeopardized in the United States. He used it for steel and aluminum, right? And in
Right.
fact, Mexico and Canada at the time
Right.
retaliated for those tariffs that were deemed illegal under the existing agreement, which was the NAFTA, and under the US commitments in the
Hmm.
WTO, because you cannot just unilaterally increase tariffs. You cannot argue that the issue of national security gives you a blank check to whenever you feel like it, increase tariffs. So we retaliated back then. So at the beginning of this administration, President Trump used that authority again, not only on steel and aluminum, but also preparing what the Department of Commerce has to conduct, which are investigations
Hmm.
specifically on all those sectors that I mentioned. They have 270 days to conduct the investigation, but it can be shorter. I mean, it's a discretionary decision by the Department of
Hmm.
Commerce. Once they come out with an analysis that determines that the imports of a particular product or a particular group of products in a sector is affecting U.S. national security, they can increase the tariffs. That is according to
Hmm.
U.S. law. Now, of course, trading partners complain that this is an excess of the application of the concept of national security, and that they shouldn't be allowed to do
Hmm.
that. But
Hmm.
that is where we are right now. I mean, steel and aluminum, not only did it start at 25% tariffs, but then, when the president was being accused of being too light on his trading partners, you remember this accusation that he was taco. Trump always chickens out. He really got
Hmm.
upset about that.
Echo.
And in a
Hmm.
matter of days, he increased the tariffs on steel and aluminum to 50%. And so, in addition to those tariffs that are already in place, these other investigations are being conducted. And of course, if you realize that Mexico, for example, is the main supplier of industrial inputs to the US, just in the automotive sector,
Hmm.
$140 billion per year imported by the US that
Hmm.
give competitiveness to the US auto sector. Multiply
Hmm.
that by all the different sectors that use steel and aluminum, and these 7 sectors that I mentioned that could be hit. It's like giving the US an enormous shot in the foot, because they're going to hurt their access to these inputs that are very important for Mexico, and obviously for Mexican exporters and
Hmm.
employment in Mexico that's related to the export sector. It could be jeopardized. Right now, we have had this sort of respect for the USMCA so far,
Hmm.
and Mexico's trying to get rid of these tariffs that we have right now in order to have a clearer path towards the USMCA review, which is another big issue coming up in
Is it
2026.
going to be a
And it's
review?
getting it's getting
Is it going to be,
complicated.
I mean, is it going to be a real, by the way, everybody, Kenneth Smith is joining us today. Was the chief negotiator for the USMCA, known in Spanish as TEMEC, which is it's a trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And we're going to have to talk about that in a couple of minutes. But it's basically, it's this commercial agreement, this trade agreement that basically has helped us define Mexico as part of North America. And of course, it's this Mexico's economy and possibility of growth towards the future really depends on its trade with the United States, and of course this trade agreement, which Kenneth, and we don't have to go into definitions, but it clearly seems that more than a review, it's going to be a renegotiation, right? I mean, it sounds like, based on what happened. Let's just talk about what happened this week, where there was an announcement made that Canada has not reached an agreement with with the United States regarding these tariffs. So I mean, you saw the announcement. What does that mean? Does that mean that Canada is now is going to be confronting in a frontal war with Donald Trump? Carney is has basically is willing to play the war game, or and or I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense. What does this mean, especially considering that there is going to be the review or renegotiation of the USMCA? What's your understanding of the status of that of
Well, the way
Canada's
things have been
position?
going for the last couple of months is that both Canada and Mexico have been negotiating individually, not
Right,
jointly, not as part of
right.
a USMCA review yet. That'll happen towards the end of the year in early 2026. But they've been
Mhm,
negotiating bilaterally with the United States to try to get rid of these tariffs. And the problem is
mhm,
that, as time goes by and we don't have a resolution of this tariff situation, the
mhm,
discussion on the tariffs, the negative impact that it has on the North
mhm,
American economy could bleed into the discussion of the USMCA review and pretty
mhm,
much lead to a renegotiation. The way it's established in the
mhm,
agreement is that the agreement will be reviewed, how it's being implemented, and whether the countries want to present recommendations as to how to improve the
mhm,
implementation. These can be done through administrative modifications that don't
mhm,
require reopening the text. But
mhm,
what we've been hearing from sources in the United States is that groups like the United Auto Workers and others, and even within the White House, this
mhm.
whole concern about China, for example,
Right.
how China's exports are entering in huge numbers into North America, the U.S. concern with investments by China in Mexico and in Canada in strategic sectors. All of that leads us to believe that it'll be hard to keep this discussion on the USMCA to a simple review, because if the US asks to reopen, for example, the automotive
Mhm,
rules of origin chapter in the USMCA to try to have provisions that prohibit, Chinese inputs from ever obtaining the trading preferences that you obtain under the USMCA. That
mhm,
is a substantive change. That means a renegotiation. And the complication with that is that if you do actually start renegotiating and changing substantive text,
mhm.
you have to have the approval of that negotiation in the Congresses of Mexico, the US, and in the Canadian
And
Parliament.
Canadian.
So, depending on how these discussions go, and indeed, you are right, they've gotten complicated with Canada and the
Mhm.
US because of this digital tax that Canada is implementing and
Right.
that is affecting US companies. And President Trump came out very, very hard in his social platform, saying that he was suspending conversations with
Mhm.
Canada on eliminating the tariffs. And so, right now, as of the last 5 hours, we don't know where we stand in terms of what could happen bilaterally between the U.S. and Canada.
Do you think, I mean, are we facing the possibility of North America, this concept of North America dissolving, that at the end of the day, that there's going to be an agreement between the United States and Mexico and the United States and Canada? I mean, can you fathom that? I mean, it seems it's almost impossible to imagine what that would mean for the whole, the way we view trade right now, and the impact, of course, it would have on the businesses. But I'm telling you, I just, you listen to Donald Trump and the way how he attacked Canada, and he was just insisting that Canada was going to be state, number 51, and he was so, aggressive against the Canadian government. I just don't know how they're going to sit down and negotiate some of this more difficult issues. So I'm just wondering that I think Mexico has a lot to gain right now, especially considering how, there's this tension between potential tension between the Canadian and the U.S. negotiators.
Yeah, I actually don't think we're facing a potential collapse of the USMCA, despite this
Mhm.
roller coaster that is likely to
Right.
last the entire Trump administration. There will
Hmm.
continue to be turbulence, but what we saw in 2017, 2018, when Trump first
Hmm.
came to power, is that he did not pull out of the NAFTA. Even though it was
Right.
not his trade agreement, he claimed it was the worst
Hmm.
agreement ever negotiated by the
And
United
use, yeah.
States. He negotiated the USMCA, and for a long time, he was saying it was the best agreement ever. So,
Huh.
there's a lot of going back and forth with him. You never know where you're really standing. But one thing that has been constant is that there hasn't been a real impetus by the Trump administration to actually pull out of the agreement. That hasn't been in
Mhm.
the narrative so far. It wasn't in the campaign.
Right.
It hasn't happened now. He's just talking about imposing tariffs to obtain specific results, right? And
Hmm.
so what I see is a scenario that's very low probability that the U.S. would eventually pull out of the USMCA. I see it as
Hmm.
less than 5% probability. But
Hmm.
what we do see is a lot of complications from these tariffs that Mexico and Canada are facing, how that can affect the review upcoming next year. And also, as you well mentioned, what happens with the structure of the USMCA? It could undergo changes. We shall see if
Hmm.
those changes are for better or for worse in terms of reducing access or at the very least maintaining the access that we have.
Hmm.
But it's not clear if the US and Canada continue on a spiral or starting a spiral of long-term trade war,
Hmm.
eventually that could definitely impact the structure of the agreement. And I think one of the big elements that was positive over the last 2 weeks was the conversations that Prime Minister Carney and President Sheinbaum had first on the phone when Prime
Right.
Minister Carney first
That's a good
arrived in
point.
power, and then during the G7 meeting where President Sheinbaum was invited. And they talked about strengthening Mexico-Canada relations, which had
Hmm.
been strained, as you know, over the last few
Right.
months, and
Hmm.
also to trying to ensure that we maintain the USMCA as a trilateral agreement because that really strengthens competition across all three countries. So right now, I think the coin is up in the air as to what will happen over the next few months. But I really don't see, despite everything, I don't see the possibility of a collapse of the USMCA because there's way too much to lose within the US economy. And I think
Right.
there'll be, if we do things right and we advocate in favor of the agreement,
Hmm.
to really have pushback by the private sector in the US and explain to the Trump administration the kind of economic calamity that would occur in several communities and across all sectors in the US
Well,
if they cancel the USMCA.
and of course, there's the China factor, which is also linked to the decisions that was made by Treasury sanctioning, possibly sanctioning these three financial institutions, because part of the accusation is that there is money laundering that is linked to Chinese companies. I mean, China is always present also in these conversations, but I think, we ran out of time. Promise me you'll come back and we'll talk about the China factor in all of these negotiations and how, Mexico is, the role Mexico is going to play in these in this trade war and the negotiations that they do have to start. They have to start settling down because this is it's too much of a roller coaster for U.S. companies, Mexican companies, and Canadian companies, and it's just they Mexican government wakes up one day and bam, there's sanctions against Mexican financial institutions. I mean, it's just too much volatility. And of course, that affects the Mexican economy and the U.S. economy and the Canadian economy and the world economy.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the main arguments that Mexico is trying to insist on with the United States is that if the entire purpose of a lot of the industrial policy, trade policy the US is implementing is trying to contain China and to compete with China, then it is essential for the US to understand that the
Correct.
Mexican economy is fundamental for the US to be able to compete with China. We are part of the solution, not part of the problem. We are not adversaries, as the
Hmm.
Attorney General referred to Mexico the other
I
day.
know.
We are, in fact, trusted partners for many, many decades. We're the number one trading partner of the US, and we can actually help the US compete with China. And that's the message that should, at the end of the day, I hope, win the day.
Well, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. I enjoyed talking to you, and you got to come back soon because this is, gosh, you just never know what's going to happen next week. It's
No,
always it's
absolutely.
always a surprise. It's always a surprise with Donald Trump returning to the White House. Kenneth Smith, he was the chief negotiator for the USMCA, known in Spanish as the MIC. It's this commercial agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. I always enjoy talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Ana Maria.
Thank you. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and thank you for joining us.